In the forgotten heart of rural America, a 19-year-old girl is sold by her own father to pay off a debt. Silenced, marked, and nameless, she is bought by a lonely widower who demands nothing but transforms everything. What begins as silence between two broken souls turns into a path of hope, love, and rebuilding. With promises made under the stars, gardens planted with pain, and a truth rising before an entire village. But what happened next? No one could have imagined. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share where you're listening from in the comments. Your support keeps this channel alive. Dusty Hollow wasn't found on most maps. A forgotten town carved into the dry heart of America, where the wind spoke louder than most people, and the days bled into one another like an old sun-faded quilt. In the summer of 1885, the sun rose early, scorching everything in its path. Crops wilted, tempers flared, and on that particular morning a crowd gathered in the main square. Not to worship, not to protest, but to watch a father sell his daughter. She stood on a makeshift platform, an old cart with splintered boards and rusted wheels, wearing a tattered dress that once held dreams stitched into its hem. Now it clung to her frame like surrender. Her name was Clara May Hastings. Just 19. Her eyes were downcast, her hands folded in front of her as if still praying for something that would never come. A thin scar curved along her left cheek, barely visible unless the light hit it just right. The kind of scar people didn't ask about. Around her, the townsfolk whispered. Some leaned in with morbid curiosity. Others turned away, ashamed to be there but unable to leave. A child clutched her mother's skirts, whispering, "Mama, why is that girl standing there?" The mother didn't answer. No one did. Beside Clara stood her father, Samuel Hastings, once a man of modest dignity, now a hollow figure soaked in whiskey and regret. His boots were caked with dry mud, his shirt stained from too many spilled bottles. $10, he shouted, voice cracking like a whip. She's strong, quiet, good with chores. $10 to start. No one moved. Clara didn't flinch. She had known this was coming. For weeks she had heard the arguments behind closed doors, seen the desperation in his eyes. He owed money. And she, by unfortunate design, had become his last bargaining chip. $8! A voice jeered from the crowd, followed by laughter. Samuel's face darkened. $10, she's worth every penny! But the crowd wasn't buying dignity that day. A man coughed. A woman shook her head. The silence between the mocking bids grew thick, like dust clinging to their throats. Clara stood motionless, her mind drifting far from the square to a childhood memory of her mother's humming, of sweet lavender tucked beneath her pillow. It was the only soft thing she could cling to. Then a voice from the back, low, even, unshaken. $50. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The words carried with them a weight that settled over the square like an evening storm. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. He stood alone, leaning slightly on the wooden railing of the blacksmith's shop. A grey hat shaded his face, but the lines around his mouth and the stillness in his eyes told more stories than any words could. Jonathan Walker, a widower. A rancher from the far edge of Dusty Hollow, where the land met the sky and nothing else. No one knew much about him, only that he lived alone on a piece of land called Silver Creek. They said he spoke to no one, carried the grief of a lost wife, and never came to town unless it was necessary. Samuel blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. 50. Jonathan nodded once. Nothing more. The crowd shifted. Whispers flew. $50 was more than anyone in that square had expected. Clara looked up, just briefly. Her eyes met his, and something passed between them. Not hope, not fear, but something heavier. Recognition, maybe. He didn't leer at her like the others had. He didn't pity her either. His gaze was steady. Quiet, like a door left slightly ajar. Sold, Samuel muttered, greed barely hidden beneath his relief. Jonathan didn't approach with haste. He walked slowly, boots crunching over gravel, until he reached the platform. He extended a hand, palm up. Clara hesitated. Her fingers twitched, uncertain whether to retreat or reach out. But the wind shifted, carrying the scent of leather, pine, and something oddly grounding. She placed her hand in his. He helped her down. Not dragging, not pushing, just guiding. It was the first time in years someone had touched her without cruelty or demand. He led her to his horse. Without speaking, he lifted her gently onto the saddle, then climbed behind her. No rope, no restraints, just silence and the long road ahead. The crowd parted. Some stared. Others turned away, ashamed. They rode in silence for a long while. The town disappeared behind them like a bad memory. The sun beat down, but there was a breeze coming off the hills that cooled Clara's neck. Her body was tense, but her mind wandered, counting birds in the sky, tracing shapes in the clouds, memorizing the rhythm of the horse's hooves. Silver Creek wasn't a place, it was a breath. A quiet piece of land nestled between dusty hills and a slow-moving stream. The ranch house was worn but clean, built with care and solitude. A barn stood to one side, its red paint faded by years of wind and sun. A tire swing hung from a tree near the porch, long forgotten. Jonathan dismounted first, then he turned to her. "Come on." His voice was calm, deeper than she expected. He reached up to help her down again, and she let him. There was no force, no command, just presence. He led her through a side door into the house. The air inside smelled of cedar and old books. Floorboards creaked beneath their feet. She noticed the simple things: a coat hanging neatly on the wall, a wooden table with one chair, a picture frame turned face down. He opened a door at the end of the hallway. Inside, a bed with a handmade quilt, a small dresser, a bowl and pitcher, and a narrow window letting in slivers of light. "This is your room," he said. "You'll be safe here." She turned toward him, but he was already stepping away. The door closed softly behind him. Clara sat on the bed. Her fingers traced the quilt's pattern, roses and vines stitched in faded red thread. Her chest rose and fell, slower now. She glanced at the window. The breeze stirred the curtain like a whisper. Her scar itched under the change in air. Safe. The word echoed in her head like a language she'd forgotten. She didn't believe it. Not yet. She lay back, eyes open, watching the ceiling as shadows stretched across the floor. Still, one question hung in the room with her, heavier than the silence, sharper than the scar on her face. What kind of man pays $50 and asks for nothing in return? Clara woke before the sun. She hadn't slept much. Her body had, out of sheer exhaustion, but her mind had wandered all night. The bed was softer than expected. The quilt smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. And the house, it was quiet. Not the kind of silence that pressed on your chest, but one that simply existed, untouched, unbothered. She sat up slowly, unsure whether to move or stay still. Her bare feet touched the wooden floor with hesitation. The boards were cold, smooth. A pitcher of clean water stood beside the bed. A clean towel, too. It felt surreal. In her father's house, things were never clean, nor offered. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon, but the sky had already shifted from black to blue-gray. Birds called from somewhere outside. Insects buzzed faintly. And somewhere in the house, floorboards creaked under deliberate steps. Clara opened the door just a crack. The hallway stretched quiet before her. She padded out in bare feet, afraid to make a sound. The house was simple, modest. Every object had a purpose. A coat hung on a wooden peg. A Bible rested on a shelf by the door, its edges worn. The living room had one armchair near the fireplace, a small table with a lantern, and nothing else. There were no clocks ticking, no voices, no shadows creeping in unwanted. She found the kitchen by instinct, drawn by the scent of something faint. Coffee. There, by the stove, stood Jonathan. He didn't turn when she entered. He was pouring hot water over grounds in a tin percolator, his movements steady, precise. The room smelled like coffee and dry wood. "You're up early," he said without looking at her. Clara paused in the doorway, uncertain. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding." Silence settled between them. He poured himself a mug and set it down on the table. Then, still without turning, he reached for a second and poured again. He placed it on the opposite side of the table and stepped away. She stared at the cup. A quiet offer. No expectations. Tentatively she approached, sat down. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug but didn't drink. Jonathan stood by the window, sipping his own coffee, eyes on the distant hills. "There's bread in the tin," he added. "Butter's fresh. You don't have to eat if you're not hungry." His voice was even, measured, not unkind. Clara's throat tightened, but she said nothing. She took a bite of bread out of politeness, though her stomach was too knotted to hold much. After a few minutes, Jonathan turned. "I won't ask you anything you don't want to answer," he said. "Not about your father, not about what came before." Clara blinked. The words sat heavy in the air. They weren't comforting exactly, but they were something else, something close. He added, "You're not here to serve anyone. This isn't that kind of arrangement." She looked down at her lap. "You'll have your room, your space. You can stay as long as you want, or leave if you ever choose to." Clara dared to meet his eyes for the first time that morning. There was no agenda in his face, no hunger, no hidden smile. Just a man speaking plainly, perhaps even awkwardly. She nodded once. That first day passed like water through cupped hands, quiet and unsure. She wandered the edges of the house, not straying far. The barn loomed at the back of the property, and beyond it stretched open fields dotted with cattle. A small stream curled along the edge of the fence line. Everywhere was dust and wind and silence, but not loneliness, not quite. Jonathan spent most of the day tending to repairs, checking fences, fixing a hinge on the barn door, cleaning tools. He moved with the kind of rhythm that came from years of doing everything alone. He didn't ask for help, didn't expect her to follow. But once, when she lingered near the garden, he looked up and said, "You can walk wherever you like. Nothing here is off limits." By nightfall, Clara had swept the front porch, not because anyone asked, just because it gave her hands something to do. She peeled vegetables, fed the chickens, washed the cup she drank from. He didn't comment, didn't praise or stop her. But when he passed her on the way to the barn that evening, he nodded once, and somehow that felt enough. The next morning she rose again before the sun. This time her body moved with a bit more certainty. She tied her hair with a faded ribbon she found in her pocket, the same one she'd had since she was 12. She stepped outside barefoot, breathing in the crisp air. In the chicken coop she gathered eggs. In the garden she noticed weeds. She pulled them. When she returned, Jonathan was already inside, drinking his coffee. He looked up as she entered, his eyes pausing for half a second. Then, "There's bacon if you want it." She nodded, sat, ate in silence. It became their rhythm. Quiet mornings, separate tasks, no questions. At night she heard the creak of his boots on the floorboards. Once she woke to the distant sound of him playing a tune on a harmonica. Low, mournful, almost hidden. She never asked him about it. Some nights she dreamed of her father's voice, sharp and slurred, echoing through the walls. But in the morning, when she opened her eyes and saw the pale beams of light across the quilt, she remembered. She was no longer in that house, no longer standing on a platform, no longer on display. Still she moved carefully, spoke little, watched everything. One afternoon she dropped a plate. It slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. Her breath caught. Her heart raced. Instinct made her freeze. Footsteps. Jonathan entered the kitchen. His eyes moved from her to the broken plate. She didn't move, didn't speak. She waited, for yelling, for judgment, for punishment. But Jonathan only bent down and gathered the shards in silence. He retrieved a broom, handed it to her gently. "It's just a plate," he said. Then he left. Clara stood still, staring at the door he had walked through. Something cracked, but not the plate. Something inside her. The days passed in soft echoes, each one folding gently into the next. Clara moved through the house like a shadow, quiet, watchful, never assuming too much space. She spoke little, ate little, and still woke before the sun, performing small tasks around the ranch that no one asked her to do. Not out of obligation, but out of habit, as if silence was her currency, and usefulness the only shield she knew. Jonathan kept his distance. He rose early too, often before her, and spent most of his time working on the land. He returned late, with dirt under his fingernails and the scent of hay clinging to his shirt. At night he rarely said more than a handful of words, but his presence never felt dangerous, just distant, self-contained, like a house with all the doors locked, not to keep anyone in, but to keep something broken from leaking out. They shared meals in silence, not cold silence, but one padded by mutual restraint. Clara was used to silence that punished. This was something else entirely, a silence that waited instead of wounded. One evening, while sweeping the kitchen floor, Clara accidentally nudged a tin cup off the table. It hit the wooden floor with a loud clatter and rolled into the wall. She flinched hard, her body tensing out of reflex, expecting a voice to rise, a hand to snap through the air, but nothing came. From the barn, she heard only the usual sound of tools clinking. No heavy boots stomping toward her, no barked orders. Still, her heart didn't calm easily. She knelt down to pick up the cup and placed it back on the table, her hands trembling faintly. The next morning it happened again, worse this time. She was drying the dishes after breakfast, stacking them carefully when one plate slipped from her damp fingers and crashed onto the floor. The sound of shattering china echoed through the kitchen like gunfire, sharp and immediate. Clara froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Her palms began to sweat. She stood motionless, surrounded by porcelain shards, unable to look away. She waited for something she couldn't name. A shout, a hand, the crash of boots. Instead, after a few seconds, she heard slow, steady footsteps from the hallway. Jonathan stepped into the kitchen, his expression unreadable as always. He looked at the broken plate, then at her. Not sharply, not with judgment, just calmly. Without a word, he crouched down and began collecting the larger shards with his bare hands, placing them gently in a wooden bowl. Then he stood, walked over to the cupboard, fetched a broom, and extended it to her. Clara stared at it. Her hands stayed by her sides. "It's just a plate," he said quietly. "We've got plenty." Then he left the room. She didn't move for a full minute. When she finally took the broom in her hands, her chest was tight, not from fear, but from something stranger, something unnameable. Her eyes burned and she blinked fast, refusing to let the tears fall. It was just a gesture, a small one, but it lodged itself somewhere deep inside her, deeper than she realized. That night, she didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of coyotes and wind scratching against the window pane. She thought of her father, how he would have raged over a broken plate, how every mistake had been another excuse to punish her for things she hadn't done. And she thought of Jonathan's hands, rough and calloused, collecting the fragments without anger. No one had ever done that for her before. The next morning, she rose even earlier than usual. She cracked the door and saw light still off in the kitchen, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She walked to the stove, lit the fire carefully, and prepared coffee the way she'd seen Jonathan do it, boiling the water, pouring it over the grounds, waiting for the aroma to rise. By the time he came in, the table was already set. 2 mugs, a loaf of warm cornbread she'd baked, using a recipe she remembered in pieces. Jonathan paused in the doorway, then glanced at the table. For a second, something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or something quieter. He walked to the table and sat down, picked up the mug, sipped. Clara watched him, nervous, unsure if she'd overstepped. He nodded once, slowly. Good coffee. A tiny smile crept to her lips, almost involuntarily. They ate in a silence that felt warmer now. Not thick with caution, but padded by something gentler, something like permission. Later that day, Jonathan asked, "Do you ride?" Clara hesitated. "Not well." He nodded again. "I'll teach you if you like." She didn't answer right away, but hours later, as he saddled the horse near the barn, she appeared beside him, her hair braided loosely, her sleeves rolled up. He said nothing, just helped her onto the horse with the same careful steadiness he had used on their first day. He didn't touch her more than necessary, didn't hover, just gave instructions, calmly, letting her take her time. When she slipped, he caught the reins. When she gripped too tight, he adjusted her fingers gently. and when she rode 5 paces without faltering, he gave a rare half smile. "Not bad," Clara laughed. "Just once, short and surprised, as if she hadn't heard her own laughter in years." Jonathan didn't comment, but he looked at her a second longer than usual. That evening, while washing her hands outside, Clara noticed something new. A rose bush behind the barn, wilted, nearly forgotten, but still standing. She walked over, touched one of the brittle petals. It reminded her of herself. Later that week, she brought out a tin of water and began tending to it, quietly, consistently. She didn't tell Jonathan, but the next day she found a small gardening spade leaning against the fence. Not a word was spoken, but something was growing. The days at Silver Creek began to settle into a rhythm that felt almost human. The mornings still held their silence, the evenings their solitude, but something had changed, subtly, slowly. Clara no longer moved like a shadow. Her presence left traces now, the scent of baking bread, a humming tune near the garden, the faint smudge of flour on her dress. She still spoke little, but her eyes no longer flinched at every sound. There was space now, between fear and breath. Jonathan noticed the difference, though he never said it aloud. He simply started placing an extra blanket by her door when the nights grew cold. He'd sharpen her garden tools without her asking. And sometimes, when the work was done, he'd sit near the porch with her, watching the sky turn copper and lavender, their silence less like a wall and more like shared shelter. But peace, as always, was a fragile thing. It was a Tuesday morning when it cracked. Clara had gone into Dusty Hollow alone for the first time since the auction. It had taken her weeks to build up the courage, and even longer to convince Jonathan she could handle it. He didn't stop her. He only said, "Don't linger." She wore a soft cotton dress, mended at the hem, and carried a small basket with eggs and herbs. She kept her head low as she walked through town, ignoring the murmurs, the stares. Some recognized her. Most pretended not to. Only one old woman offered a nod, and Clara returned it, grateful. She'd just stepped out of the general store when she heard the voice. Well, look what the wind dragged back." The words dropped like stones at her feet. She turned. There he was, Raymond Sullivan. Older than she remembered, but no less terrifying. His face had deepened into hard lines like weathered leather, and his eyes, small, calculating, still held that glint of ownership. He wore a dark coat that didn't belong to the season, and a grin that didn't belong to any decent man. Clara froze. Raymond stepped closer, his boots slow and deliberate on the dusty ground. "Didn't expect to see you walking free, Clara. Thought you'd be halfway to nowhere by now, or buried under that pretty little garden you like so much." Her throat closed. He leaned in. "You remember what your daddy signed, don't you? That paper? You were never his to give away, girl. You were mine. Still are." The basket slipped from her fingers, eggs shattering across the road. Raymond didn't flinch. "How you've been hiding behind a man who don't know the law," he said, voice like gravel soaked in spite. "But I do, and I've come to collect what's owed." Clara stepped back, breath ragged. But Raymond didn't touch her. Not yet. He simply tipped his hat mockingly and walked away, his boots leaving dusty scars on the road. She didn't remember walking home. She didn't remember the path or the trees or the sound of birds overhead, only the cold creeping through her spine. The return of that old paralyzing fear. When Jonathan saw her ride into the yard, pale and shaking, he knew. He didn't ask what happened. He simply helped her off the horse and sat her down on the porch. She didn't speak, just stared at her hands as they trembled. He went inside, fetched a blanket, draped it around her shoulders, then sat beside her. "Who?" he asked quietly. She swallowed hard. "Raymond Sullivan." His jaw clenched. "He says he has papers from my father." Jonathan nodded once. He didn't speak for a long time, then, "He won't come here." Clara looked at him. "You don't know him." "I don't need to." That night, neither of them slept. Jonathan paced. Clara sat by the window, watching the wind toss the trees like they might pull themselves from the earth. She remembered Raymond too well, the way he used to visit their home when her father was gone, the way he spoke to her, slow, slimy, as if he already owned her. He'd called her investment, collateral. When she was 14, the paper he mentioned was real. She'd seen it once, a crude contract scribbled in whiskey-stained ink, her name written in block letters like a brand. She had never told anyone. Until now. She sat at the kitchen table, candlelight flickering, and told Jonathan everything. He didn't interrupt, just listened. When she finished, he stood, walked to the stove, and poured her tea with steady hands. "You're not his," he said softly. "You never were." The next morning, Clara didn't tend the garden. She sat on the porch with a blanket over her knees, eyes scanning the road like it might erupt. And 2 days later, it did. Raymond returned, this time on horseback, flanked by 2 men who looked more like vultures than friends. They rode into Silver Creek like they owned the land. Jonathan stepped out before they reached the porch. Clara stood behind him, heart in her throat. Raymond pulled out a folded piece of paper and waved it in the air like a flag. "Signed by Samuel Hastings, in exchange for 3 barrels of rye, witnessed and dated, legal. That girl belongs to me." Jonathan didn't take the paper. He didn't look at the men. "You come onto my land again," he said, "and I won't call the sheriff. I'll bury what's left of you behind the barn." One of the other men chuckled, a dry, cruel sound. Raymond didn't. His eyes narrowed. "You think I'm bluffing?" Jonathan asked, voice low, calm. "Try me." Raymond stared at him for a long time, then at Clara. Finally, he tucked the paper back into his coat. "This ain't over," he muttered, turning his horse. "You know that." And he rode away. Clara's knees gave out the moment they were gone. She sank to the porch, hands gripping the wood like it might fall out from under her. Jonathan sat beside her. She couldn't stop shaking. "Let him come back," he said after a long silence. "Next time I won't just talk." Clara looked at him, eyes wide, with something new. Not fear, not gratitude. Something deeper. A knowing. The wind picked up. The leaves rustled. And somewhere beyond the hills, a storm began to brew. The storm didn't start with thunder. It began with silence. That heavy, pressing kind of silence that sits on your chest before the sky even darkens. Birds fled early. The wind changed direction. Horses grew restless. And Clara knew something was coming. Not just in the sky, in her blood, in her bones. She hadn't slept the night before. After Raymond's visit, the fear didn't just linger. It grew roots inside her. Every creak in the floorboards felt like a threat. Every gust of wind, a whisper of danger. Jonathan, as always, said little, but she saw it in the way he moved, tighter, more alert. He kept the shotgun close now, repaired the fence twice, slept lighter, watched the horizon like it owed him answers. Clara began pulling away, slowly at first, skipping meals, sitting alone in the field with the rosebush, listening to the leaves talk in the wind, watching her hands and wondering what part of her still belonged to herself. She couldn't bear the idea that Jonathan might suffer because of her, that this quiet world he had built, so fragile, so honest, could be shattered just because she had stepped into it. Her whole life she had been a burden passed from one man to another, sold, leased, threatened, branded. Now for the first time, someone had chosen her without cruelty, and she feared that alone would cost him everything. So on the 3rd night after Raymond's visit, as the clouds collapsed into thunder and the sky cracked open like old wood, Clara made a decision. She packed nothing. She left quietly. Just after midnight, she crept from her room, barefoot, wearing only her thin cotton dress. The wind howled through the cracks in the window, and lightning lit the hallway in flickers. She paused by the front door, hand on the knob, listening. No movement. Jonathan must have been asleep. She stepped outside into the rain. It hit her like a curtain, cold, relentless, wild, but she welcomed it. The rain drowned her heartbeat, washed her hesitation. She ran across the yard, slipping once in the mud, heart pounding, lungs burning. The fields ahead were black waves beneath the storm. She didn't have a plan, only the need to disappear. If she wasn't here, Raymond would have no reason to return. Jonathan wouldn't be dragged into this war. She would be the storm's offering, and that, somehow, felt less cruel than watching someone else bleed for her freedom. The rain turned the road into a river of clay. She stumbled again, knees scraping gravel. Her dress clung to her like second skin, heavy and soaked. Her breath came in short, frantic bursts. She reached the edge of the woods and collapsed under a rock ledge, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't even brush the wet hair from her face. She curled into herself, pressing her back to the stone as thunder shattered the sky above her. Her thoughts unraveled. She thought of her mother's hands braiding her hair. She thought of the plate Jonathan had swept up. She thought of the rose bush behind the barn and the little spade he'd left leaning by the fence. She thought of the way he looked at her, not as property, not as pity, but as presence. And she cried, not from fear, but from the grief of leaving something that had begun to feel like hope. Back at the house, Jonathan woke to the sound of the storm. Then the silence of her room. The door was open. Her bed was empty. For a man who moved with deliberate calm, he became a blur. Boots, coat, saddle. He didn't yell, didn't panic, just rode into the dark, eyes scanning every tree, every shadow. The rain blinded him, the wind roared in his ears, but he followed the path, or what remained of it, trusting the ground, trusting the feeling in his gut that she hadn't gone far. He found her by the rocks, curled like a child, her arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't hear the horse. She didn't look up until he was beside her, lifting her gently, wordlessly, as if she were made of paper and the storm could tear her apart at any second. She didn't resist, didn't explain, didn't speak. He wrapped her in his coat. It was warm, smelled of leather and ash. He carried her to the horse and lifted her into the saddle in one fluid motion, then climbed behind her, one arm around her waist, the other guiding the reins. They rode back through wind and fire. Clara trembled, not from cold, but from something deeper, the ache of being seen, the horror of being loved. When they reached the house, he didn't scold her. He led her inside, dried her feet, brought warm blankets. Then he knelt beside her, looked her in the eyes, really looked, and said only this: "You are not anyone's debt, not his, not your father's, not even mine. While you are here, no one touches you." She tried to answer, tried to apologize, but her voice cracked before it reached her lips. Jonathan didn't need her words. He simply placed his hand over hers, rough palm meeting trembling fingers, and for the first time since she was sold, Clara felt something she couldn't quite name. Not safety. Not yet, but the beginning of it. And outside, as the storm began to break, a single fragile thought settled in her chest. Maybe running wasn't the only way to survive. The storm passed, but it didn't leave everything the same. The next morning, the sun rose timidly through clouds still swollen with memory. The ground around Silver Creek was soaked, streaked with runnels of red clay. Branches littered the yard. The fence on the southern edge had collapsed. But nothing was broken that couldn't be mended. The house stood. The barn stood. And inside, Clara May Hastings sat beside the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the mist rise off the fields like smoke from an old wound. She hadn't spoken much since Jonathan brought her back. But her silence had changed. It wasn't a silence of fear anymore. It was the quiet that comes after tears, after a storm, the kind of silence that says, "I'm still here." Jonathan didn't press her. He never did. He fixed the fence, fed the livestock, went about the day as if it were any other. But she knew he was watching, not with suspicion, with care. A quiet sort of readiness that said, "You don't have to tell me what hurts for me to know you're healing." That afternoon, Clara stood in the backyard near the barn, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the patch of earth behind the stable. It was nothing more than a mess of mud and weeds, but her eyes lingered there, like she could see something no one else could. When Jonathan passed by with a pail of nails, she turned to him and asked softly, "Do you mind if I plant something back here?" He stopped, looked at the patch of earth, then at her. "No," he said. "It's yours." 3 simple words. She nodded and walked inside without another word. But that night, after dinner, he left a wooden crate by her door. Inside were gloves, a trowel, packets of seeds, some wildflowers, some herbs. Lavender, basil, sage, sunflower. No note. He didn't need one. The next morning, Clara was outside before dawn, kneeling in the wet soil. Her hair was tied back with a ribbon. Her hands worked slowly, gently, pressing the seeds into the earth like prayers. She whispered nothing aloud, but each gesture carried weight. She wasn't just planting. She was reclaiming something. The first few days were hard. The soil was stubborn. Her arms ached. The sun returned with vengeance, burning the back of her neck as she worked. But she didn't stop. Jonathan passed her often, always quiet. He handed her a tin of water without being asked, replaced her broken trowel with a stronger one, built a simple wooden fence to keep the chickens out. He never asked what she was planting, but he watered when she forgot, and cleared the rocks when her hands blistered. In the evenings they sat on the porch together, smelling of dirt and sweat and something strangely tender. Their silences changed shape, less like strangers, more like survivors. Each evening Clara grew a little less guarded. Sometimes she hummed, sometimes she spoke. One night, as they watched the stars blink through the last clouds of the storm, she said, "I used to dream about growing things." Jonathan turned to her. "What stopped you?" Clara smiled faintly. "I stopped believing anything would grow around me." He didn't respond, but the next day she found a small wooden bench beside the garden, handcrafted, weathered, waiting. The plants grew slowly, like trust, like breath, like the first notes of music after too much silence. Lavender sprouted first, defying the stubborn soil. Then basil, fragrant and alive. By the end of the second week, Clara was waking with purpose. She laughed once when a rabbit stole a sprout. Jonathan pretended not to notice the sound, but his eyes softened in the way they always did when she wasn't looking. Some days, they worked side by side, not talking much, but moving in rhythm, pulling weeds, carrying buckets, kneeling in the dirt like pilgrims searching for forgiveness in the roots. And slowly the garden took shape. It wasn't perfect. Some rows were crooked, some seeds didn't sprout, but it was real. It was hers. And as the blossoms opened, Clara began to feel something she hadn't dared name in years: belonging. One afternoon, she found Jonathan staring at the sky, his hand resting on a fence post. His eyes weren't angry or distant, just far away. She approached, brushing dirt from her apron. "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her, surprised by the question. Then, "Nothing in particular." She tilted her head. "I don't believe that." He smiled, a real one this time, small but deep. "I was thinking, it's been a long time since this place felt alive." Clara looked around, at the flowers blooming near the barn, the soft hum of bees returning, the way the wind moved through the tall grass like a hymn. "Maybe it needed to be broken before it could breathe again," she said. Jonathan nodded. That night they shared bread baked with herbs from the garden. They didn't speak about Raymond, or her father, or the scars she still hid beneath her sleeves. But the silence between them was full of light. After dinner, she walked barefoot into the garden, standing still beneath the moonlight. Her hands brushed the lavender, and a breeze moved the leaves gently, like the earth itself exhaled. Jonathan watched from the porch. He didn't say a word. But in that moment, Clara knew. Not just that she was safe. She was beginning again. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in it. The letter arrived in a plain, weather-worn envelope, slipped beneath the kitchen door one quiet morning. There was no return address, no seal. Just Clara's name in a wavering hand, like someone had written it through a trembling memory. She found it while sweeping the floor, the broom's bristles catching on the paper. At first, she didn't recognize the handwriting. Then her chest tightened. It had been nearly 10 years since she'd seen it. Her mother's script. Margaret Hastings. The name alone was enough to make her palms go cold. She held the letter like it might vanish, like it was a ghost. Jonathan, sensing the shift in her breathing, looked up from the firewood he was stacking. "You all right?" She nodded. "It's from someone I used to know." He didn't press. He never did. Just gave a slight nod and stepped outside to give her space. Clara sat at the table and opened the envelope. Inside was a single page. The ink was uneven, smudged in places. The words scratched like they'd been pulled from someone who wasn't sure they had the right to speak. "My dearest Clara, I don't know if you'll read this or burn it. I wouldn't blame you either way. I haven't earned the right to ask for anything. But if this letter reaches you, it means I'm still here, still breathing, still hoping. They tell me I don't have much time. That's not why I'm writing. I'm writing because there are things I should have said long ago and I never did. I left because I was afraid. Not of you, never of you, of him, of what I was becoming. I should have taken you with me. I should have fought harder. I should have done everything differently. I never stopped thinking about you, never. I am at St. Augustine Rest Home, room 12. If you choose to come, I will wait. If you don't, I'll understand. All my love." Margaret Clara read the letter twice, then a third time. The words didn't sting like she expected. They didn't soothe either. They just hung in the air, sharp and soft all at once. Her mother, the woman who vanished one night without a goodbye, who let Clara face Samuel alone, let the darkness take root in every corner of their home, wanted to speak now? Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer. She didn't speak of it for 3 days, but the weight of it followed her, into the garden, the kitchen, even into her sleep. She'd dream of Margaret's voice, not the real one, but how it used to sound when she whispered lullabies through locked doors. Finally, on the 4th morning, she told Jonathan. He didn't ask why she hadn't said anything sooner. He didn't ask if she planned to go. He just said, "I'll drive you there." They borrowed a neighbor's cart and took the road east. The journey to St. Augustine took nearly half a day. The fields gave way to woods, then to a town Clara had only seen once before, a blur of white buildings and cobblestone streets. The rest home sat on a quiet hill, tucked between trees that bowed gently in the wind. The building was old, but clean. Flowers bloomed in pots by the door. A nurse greeted them, kind-eyed and gentle. "She's awake," the nurse said softly. "She's been waiting." Clara stood in the hallway outside room 12 for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly. Jonathan touched her shoulder. "Take your time." Then he stepped away. Clara pushed the door open. The room was small, warm. A window let in soft afternoon light. And there, in a chair by the window, sat a woman, older than Clara remembered, thinner, her hair grey and braided down one side. Margaret turned slowly. Her eyes widened. She didn't rise, didn't speak right away. She simply stared, like she was afraid that if she blinked, the moment would disappear. Clara stepped inside, closed the door behind her. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Margaret's voice, hoarse low, broke the air. "You came." Clara nodded once. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "You sent a letter. I read it." Margaret's hands shook in her lap. "I didn't know if it would reach you." It did. More silence. Heavy, but not angry, just unresolved. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, tears filling her eyes. "For everything. I was weak. I was broken. I thought leaving was saving you." Clara sat across from her. "You didn't save me. You left me with him." Margaret covered her mouth with one hand. A sob escaped before she could swallow it. "I know," she whispered. "I see your face in every dream, every nightmare. I wanted to come back so many times, but shame is a heavy anchor." Clara looked out the window. The trees swayed, sunlight slipping through their leaves like forgiveness waiting to fall. "I didn't come here for you," she said softly. Margaret looked up, startled. "I came for me." Her voice didn't tremble. "I needed to see your eyes and know that your absence wasn't my fault, that I didn't drive you away, that the silence wasn't because I wasn't worth staying for." Margaret wept openly now, her hands clutching her lap like they might anchor her to the moment. "I was a child," Clara said, voice steady, "and you were the only one who could have stopped him." "I failed you," Margaret whispered. Clara nodded. "Yes, you did." They sat in silence for a long time after that. The light shifted. The wind moved through the trees like an old hymn. Eventually, Margaret said, "You don't have to forgive me." Clara stood. "I'm not here to forgive." She walked to the door, paused. "But I hope wherever you go next, you don't leave a little girl behind this time." Margaret cried harder than she had in years. Clara stepped into the hallway, heart pounding but strangely light. Jonathan was waiting near the exit, arms crossed, eyes gentle. She didn't speak. He didn't ask. They walked back to the cart, the sun low in the sky. As they rode away, Clara looked back once at the building, now swallowed by trees. She didn't feel healed, but she felt whole, and maybe that was enough for now. Dusty Hollow hadn't changed much since the day Clara was auctioned in its sunburned square. The same cracked bricks lined the storefronts. The same rusted wind chimes clinked outside the general store. The same whispers drifted on the air like dust. But something in Clara had changed. It had been nearly 3 months since she last set foot in the village. 3 months of rebuilding, healing, breathing. The garden behind the barn now bloomed with color. Jonathan's eyes had softened around the edges. Her voice, once locked inside her chest, now slipped out in quiet sentences and full thoughts. She still moved carefully through the world, but she no longer moved afraid. So when the letter arrived by courier, stamped with a sheriff's mark, summoning Jonathan to town for a formal dispute over the ownership of property once transferred by legal agreement, Clara didn't let him go alone. "This is mine to face," she said. Jonathan didn't argue. The morning was hot, even by Dusty Hollow's dry standards. The sun bore down hard as they rode together into the square. Clara wore a simple cotton dress, her hair braided loosely down her back. No jewelry, no hat, only the scar on her cheek visible beneath the sunlight. A crowd had already gathered. Raymond Sullivan stood smug and tall near the well, his coat crisp, his boots polished. In his hands, the folded paper he claimed as proof of ownership. Beside him stood 2 officials from the county, men who didn't know Clara, who didn't know her story. They only knew contracts. Jonathan stood to her right, silent and steady. Clara could feel his calm like a wall behind her back, but she didn't lean on it. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Dellard, whom Clara remembered from her childhood, called for order. "We're here on account of a disputed contract," he said. "Claimant Mr. Sullivan has brought forth a signed agreement dated 3 years back between himself and Mr. Samuel Hastings, which, by the letter of the law, names Ms. Clara May as—" "Don't say it," Jonathan warned sharply. Dellard paused. Raymond smirked. "Say it or don't. The paper says what it says. She was exchanged in settlement of a debt. I'm just here to collect." Murmurs broke out in the crowd. Some gasped. Others stared at Clara with wide eyes, unsure what to believe. Clara stepped forward. Her hands trembled, but only slightly. She looked first at Dellard, then at the paper in Raymond's hands, then finally at the crowd she once feared. "I was 16, she said clearly, "when my father sold me." The square went quiet. I was 16, no voice, no say, just fear. She paused, scanning the faces. "I lived in a house where silence kept me alive, where doors stayed closed, where every kindness had a price." People began to shift uncomfortably now. Eyes dropped. Some women covered their mouths. "That paper," she continued, nodding at Raymond's hand, "is real. I won't lie about that, but so are my hands, my breath, my voice." She took a step closer. "I am not a goat, not a cow, not a sack of grain. I am not property. I am not anyone's settlement." Raymond rolled his eyes. "You're being dramatic." "No," she said. "I'm being heard." Another murmur rippled through the crowd, but this one sounded different, supportive, restless. Clara turned to Dellard. "Tell me, Sheriff, would you hand your daughter over to a man with a contract like that?" Dellard's jaw tightened. "No," he admitted. Raymond snapped, "It's not about decency, it's about the law." Clara held up her hand. "Then let the law see what happens when we call girls by numbers and debts instead of names." She turned to the townspeople. "How many of you knew? How many looked away? When I stood on that cart, how many of you watched and said nothing?" Silence. "I forgive you," she said, "but I won't go quietly." Jonathan moved closer, placing a firm hand on her shoulder, not to hold her back, but to anchor her. "I am here," Clara said, "to say I am not for sale, not now, not ever again." A single clap broke the silence, then another. Within moments, the square echoed with the sound of hands coming together, slow, uneven, then growing louder. Dozens of people clapping, some standing taller, some wiping tears from their cheeks. Raymond turned pale. Sheriff Dellard raised a hand. "Mr. Sullivan, based on the evidence and the circumstances under which this so-called contract was signed, I declare it void and unenforceable in this county. You will leave this woman in peace, and you will leave this town immediately." Raymond opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Jonathan stepped forward, quiet as always. "You heard him." Raymond looked around for allies, for strength, for something to lean on. There was nothing. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode out of Dusty Hollow to a chorus of silence and shame. As the dust settled, Clara stood still in the square, not trembling, not hiding, just standing. For the first time, she felt her feet firmly planted in the dirt where she once knelt. A little girl once disappeared in this town, but a woman had returned. And now, with the contract in ashes and the crowd dispersing with something like awe, Clara turned to Jonathan and whispered, "Do you think anything ever really changes in a place like this?" He looked around, then at her. Maybe it already has. The smell was the first warning. Not smoke, not at first, but something sharper, acrid, like burning oil soaked into old wood. It snuck into the windows, curling through the cracks beneath the door. Clara was in the kitchen folding laundry when she felt it. She paused, turned toward the breeze drifting in through the open window. Something about it was wrong, thick, tainted. She stepped onto the porch and saw it, a flicker of orange behind the barn. At first her mind couldn't place it, the way the light danced in unnatural rhythm. Then her eyes widened, heat shimmered in the distance, sparks lifted into the sky like fireflies trying to escape something bigger than themselves. She dropped the basket. "Jonathan!" she shouted. He was already running. By the time they reached the barn, flames had taken the eastern wall. The roof was still intact, but the blaze was hungry, licking its way toward the loft where hay had been stored for winter. The fire crackled like fury, spitting embers into the air. The horses inside screamed. Clara gasped. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the axe by the water trough, swung the barn door open, and ran inside. "Jonathan!" she cried out. He disappeared into the smoke. Clara ran for the pump, grabbing the closest bucket, filling it with trembling hands. Her heart raced. Her lungs burned just watching the flames. But she didn't stop. She threw the first bucket against the blaze, then the second, then another. Behind her, a voice called out, "Clara!" It was Ruth Jennings, the neighbor who ran the dairy farm 2 miles north. Then came her husband, then others. One by one, riders and neighbors appeared like ghosts out of the smoke. They came with buckets, with blankets, with shovels, with hands. Nobody asked, nobody explained. They just moved. Men lined up from the well to the barn in a human chain, passing water with wordless precision. Women soaked sheets and covered the horses as Jonathan led them out, coughing and ash-covered. Even children helped, gathering stones, fetching more water, holding tools. Clara didn't recognize half the faces, but they were there. For her, for him, for the land. She turned just in time to see Jonathan stumble out of the barn, dragging the last of the feed sacks clear of the blaze. His face was streaked with soot, his shirt torn, but his eyes were alive. The fire didn't go down without a fight. It roared, cracked beams sent plumes of smoke twisting into the sky like warning signals, but the people held the line. The buckets kept coming. And finally, after what felt like hours, the flames collapsed into steam and charred wood. The barn still stood, though part of the east wall was gone. Smoke lingered, thick and bitter, but it was over. Clara stood breathless in the center of the yard, soaked to the skin, mud on her dress, her arms shaking. Then someone clapped her on the back, gently. "Guess this place matters after all," said Mr. Braddock, the gruff farmer who had once offered $5 for her at the auction. She looked at him, stunned. He tipped his hat. "You've built something here, something real." Others nodded, murmured agreements. Faces she barely knew now felt familiar. Connected, not by words, but by action. She turned and found Jonathan leaning against the trough, exhausted, his hands bleeding where splinters had torn skin. She rushed to him. "You went inside," she whispered. "I couldn't let them burn," he said simply. Clara reached for his hands, cradled them in her own. She didn't care that they were dirty, torn. They were alive, and they had held everything together. A hush fell over the yard as people began to gather around what remained of the barn. The roses behind it were scorched but not lost. The lavender was singed but clinging to life, like her. Sheriff Dellard arrived last, out of breath, horse still saddled. "Raymond?" Clara asked before he could speak. He nodded grimly. "We found tracks, headed north. Someone saw him near the barn earlier today. Will you go after him?" Dellard looked around at the people standing shoulder to shoulder in the ash. "We don't have to. He already lost." That night, long after everyone had gone, Clara and Jonathan sat side by side on the porch. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The wind was warm, the stars clear. The barn still smoked gently in the dark. But their home, their hope, had not burned. And as Clara rested her head against Jonathan's shoulder, eyes heavy with exhaustion, one quiet truth settled into the space between them. Some things are stronger after fire. The barn still smelled faintly of smoke, even after 2 days of wind and sunlight. Its eastern wall had been patched with fresh planks, pale and raw against the blackened beams. Life was returning to Silver Creek in quiet ways, the way a single green sprout dares to grow through cracked earth. Clara stood barefoot in the garden, her fingers tracing the stems of lavender that had survived the fire. The damage hadn't touched her roses. She took that as a sign, not of luck, but of something more stubborn: resilience. Jonathan had said little since the night the barn burned, but his actions spoke in louder tongues, fixing the trough, mending the gate, washing soot from the horses' coats. He moved like a man who had fought a storm and lived to carry the silence afterward. That evening, as the sun slid behind the hills and painted the world in copper and ash, Clara found him sitting on the porch steps, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at nothing. She sat beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Clara whispered, "Do you ever think about starting over?" Jonathan's gaze didn't shift. "I think that's what we've been doing." She turned toward him. The light caught the edge of his face, sharp, weathered, but softened now. Open in a way it hadn't been before. "I don't mean just rebuilding what we lost," she said. "I mean building something that was never allowed to begin." He finally looked at her. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was holy, sacred in its stillness. "I've never asked you for anything," she said. "You don't have to." "I know," she replied. "But I want to." He didn't interrupt. Clara reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out 2 thin bands of copper, polished and warm from the heat of her skin. Simple, unadorned. "I found these in the drawer of your old workshop," she said. They looked forgotten. Jonathan took one, turning it in his calloused fingers. They were. "My father made them, said they'd last longer than gold." Clara offered a faint smile. "Then they'll do." He blinked, slowly. "You sure?" She nodded. "No preacher," he said. "No paper. No chains," she added. He looked at her, eyes quiet and alive. "What would we promise?" Clara took his hand. Her voice was steady, soft. "I promise not to run." Jonathan held her gaze. "I promise to stay, even when it's easier to disappear." She placed the band on his finger. He slid the other onto hers. There was no audience, no applause, just the wind and the stars and the sound of crickets weaving their song through the night. Then he stood and offered his hand. She followed him through the pasture, past the barn, through the tall grass that brushed their legs like silk. They stopped in the clearing where the sky opened wide, an ocean of dark velvet, dusted with silver light. There, under the stars, they lay side by side on a quilt she had sewn herself. No words, just breath, touch. The kind that speaks without taking, the kind that listens. He traced the scar on her cheek with a reverence that made her close her eyes. She ran her fingers through his hair, once black, now streaked with grey, and whispered nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The night held them like an answer. There was no hunger in their touch, no urgency, just presence, just promise. They didn't speak of the past. They didn't speak of what might come, only of this, the now. The moment when two people, battered and whole in the same breath, chose each other without permission from the world. When dawn broke, the sky was pink and gold. The first bird called. The earth was damp with dew. Jonathan was already awake, watching her. She opened her eyes, sleepy but smiling. He touched the copper ring on her finger. "Still there," he said. "So am I," she replied. They walked back hand in hand, barefoot through the morning mist. They didn't need vows etched in stone. They were etched in soil, in ash, in skin. And as the sun rose behind them, Clara knew what had begun in silence would now grow in truth. Years passed in the quiet way they do when a place becomes home. Silver Creek, once a stretch of wounded earth and silence, was now filled with motion, with noise, with life. What had once been a refuge for two became a hearth for many. Clara stood at the doorway of the house one golden morning, a child on her hip, another tugging at her apron, and a third running barefoot through the yard, chasing chickens with a stick and a war cry only he understood. Her hair was loose, streaked with sunshine. The lines around her eyes were deeper now, not from worry but from smiling. The house had grown. Jonathan had added a second room, then a third. Clara had turned the old storage room into a library, or what she liked to call a dream room filled with shelves, paper and soft light. The garden had tripled in size, now holding not just lavender and basil, but tomatoes, squash, and even strawberries in spring. And the people came. It started with one girl, 12, shy from a farm up the road, whose parents wanted her to learn to read. Clara taught her on Sundays under the sycamore. Then came 2 boys, then 5 more. Soon, families were sending their children to Silver Creek, not just for letters and numbers, but for something harder to name: safety, presence, trust. Clara taught reading, writing, a little history. She told stories, showed them how to plant seeds and care for things that could not speak. The children listened. They always listened. Perhaps because Clara never raised her voice, and they could feel in her silences that she had once been unheard. Jonathan taught the older boys how to build, how to fix broken fences and broken wheels, how to guide a horse without breaking its spirit. He didn't talk much, but when he did, they leaned in. There was weight behind his words, and none of it came from pride. They built a second barn together, painted it red. On the front, Clara carved a small wooden plaque that read, "Where Voices Grow." Every Saturday, people gathered. There was no official meeting, no preaching, just food, laughter, and stories. Women brought pies. Men repaired each other's tools. Someone always played music, usually a fiddle, sometimes just hands clapping on a barrel. Clara would sit on the porch, watching the children run, watching her own sons wrestle in the grass, and wonder how something so broken could become something so whole. She kept the copper ring, wore it every day, not because she needed proof, but because it reminded her that love, when chosen freely, becomes a foundation stronger than blood. Jonathan grew grayer, slower. He still woke before the sun, still fixed what needed fixing. But sometimes he sat longer in the chair beneath the tree, with a book in his lap and a child curled asleep on his chest. He never told stories about the fire, or the barn, or the day he rode through the storm to find Clara beneath the rocks. But every time someone asked why he let strangers onto his land, he would say, "This land saved us. Now it's theirs too." There were hard days, of course. A drought one summer, a bad winter. Once the youngest boy fell and broke his arm, and Clara didn't sleep for 2 nights. But never again did fear own her. She had faced it, burned it, buried it. And in its place, she built a table long enough to feed whoever came hungry. One evening, after the children had gone to bed and the fire had softened into embers, Clara stood in the garden. The moon was full. The lavender glowed silver. Jonathan came beside her, his hand brushing hers. "They're growing fast," he said, nodding toward the house. Clara smiled. "So is the garden. You miss the quiet?" he asked. She shook her head. "The silence used to keep me small. Now it reminds me how far I've come." They stood there, 2 shadows under the stars, holding all the things they never thought they'd have. Children, home, peace. And just beyond the fence, near the edge of the old pasture, a new family had begun building their own home. a small cabin rising plank by plank, helped by every able hand in the valley. The world, Clara thought, may never be perfect. But here, in this pocket of dust and grace, something real had taken root, real. And tomorrow, when the sun rose, she'd teach the children a new story, not about kings or battles, but about a woman who once believed she was too broken to be chosen, and the man who never asked her to be anything but free. The day began like any other. Slow light spilling through the window, soft footsteps in the hallway, the distant laughter of children chasing each other barefoot across the porch. But Clara felt it before the sun even cleared the hills. Something in the air had shifted, not in the wind, not in the soil, inside her. The day before, her youngest son had asked a question. "Mama, who were you before you were ours?" She hadn't answered right away. How could she explain what it meant to have once been invisible? To have belonged to no one, not even herself? How could she describe a silence so thick it made her forget the sound of her own name? That night, she hadn't slept. She sat in the small room behind the garden, the one that used to be a storage shed and now held scraps of stories, dried herbs, and bits of cloth she collected over the years. And in the bottom drawer of the cedar chest, wrapped in brown paper and time, lay the dress, the one she had worn the day her father sold her, faded now, frayed at the sleeves. The seam along the side still held the threads of fear. She ran her hand across the fabric, remembering the weight of it on her body as she stood on that cart in the center of Dusty Hollow, remembering the way the dust rose with every breath she dared take, remembering how the crowd watched, not with cruelty, not with kindness, but with indifference. It was not a dress anymore. It was a grave, and it was time to bury it. She rose before dawn, wrapped the bundle in her arms, and stepped into the cold morning air. The stars were still visible, fading behind the veil of approaching light. She walked to the edge of the pasture where the fire pit sat, the same pit where neighbors once roasted corn during harvest feasts, where Jonathan told the boys how to read the wind, and where she taught the girls that a story once spoken can change everything. She placed the bundle on the dry wood, took a breath, and lit the match. The flame caught quickly. It climbed the cotton like memory, like grief, like release. Clara didn't cry. She stood there, arms crossed, the fire warming her cheeks as the fabric curled inward and turned to ash. In the smoke, she saw pieces of herself she no longer needed. The silence, the shame, the belief that she was only worth what someone else was willing to pay. She whispered into the wind, not a prayer but a truth. "I am not what was done to me." Behind her, the sun rose. Soft footsteps approached. Jonathan. He didn't speak, just stood beside her as the last threads vanished into smoke. Later that morning, she gathered the children in the shade of the sycamore. They sat cross-legged, dirt on their knees, leaves in their hair. She opened the book, not the one with kings and castles, but the one she had written herself. "Today," she said, "I'll tell you the story of a girl who was traded for $50. Their eyes widened. "But that's not where the story ends," she continued. "Because one day that girl planted a garden, and what she grew couldn't be sold, it couldn't be stolen, it could only be given." They leaned in, quiet now. She found a place where silence was no longer her enemy, where fire didn't destroy but refined, where love didn't come with a price. One of the children raised a hand. "Was it real?" Clara smiled. "It still is." That evening, she stood again by the garden, watching her sons chase fireflies, watching Jonathan teach a neighbor's boy how to mend a wheel, watching the world she once thought would never be hers unfold before her like a quilt stitched by steady hands. She touched the copper ring on her finger, not because she needed to remember the day they exchanged it, but because she could. The air was warm. The roses bloomed again. The barn still bore the scars of fire, but it stood strong just like her. And as the stars returned to the sky, Clara whispered to the earth beneath her feet, "Here, where I bled, I have bloomed. Here, where I was silenced, I found my voice. Here, where they tried to break me, I learned to love without fear." And far off in the distance, the wind carried her voice like seed across the valley. Not everyone heard it, but those who needed to did. She was auctioned off as if she were worth nothing, but she chose to bloom where she was wounded. Clara didn't rewrite the past, she turned it into roots. The ranch that once was solitude became a home. The hands that once trembled with fear now teach others to plant, read, and choose. Because sometimes the greatest revolution is born from the silence of those who dare to stay. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share where you're listening from in the comments. Your support allows us to continue bringing stories like this.